The quiet of the ICU was almost tangible, broken only by the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional shuffle of nurses' footsteps. Each room contained a story of struggle, of battles fought silently. In these walls, hope sometimes felt distant, like an echo in a cavern. But today, something different was in the air. President Donald Trump had come to visit, not for a typical press photo or a public appearance, but to meet those who had been fighting the most personal of battles. It wasn't about policy or politics. It was about people, real lives, in the throes of real suffering, who still needed to be seen. Among the patients was Sarah, a woman whose face was worn from years of hardship. She had been homeless for most of her adult life, and after a recent series of health crises, had found herself in the ICU fighting for her life. Her body, frail from exhaustion and illness, lay still beneath the white sheets, but her eyes were full of stories that words could never capture. The doctors had warned that her chances were slim, but Sarah wasn't a woman to back down easily. Trump entered the room, his presence commanding but not overpowering. He stepped toward Sarah's bed, and for a moment there was a pause, an unspoken acknowledgement that this meeting was more than a formality. "Sarah," Trump said gently, his voice carrying sincerity. "I've heard about your story. You've been through so much, but you're still here. That's something special." Sarah blinked, too tired to fully process what was happening, but she nodded slowly. "I've lived through a lot, Mr. President. I didn't expect to make it this far." Trump sat at the edge of her bed, not as a politician, but as someone who was genuinely trying to understand. "I know it's hard. Life can throw some brutal punches, but what matters is that you're still standing. You've got a fight in you." Her eyes flickered with a mix of disbelief and something else. Maybe hope. "I've always fought, but after everything, sometimes it feels like there's nothing left to fight for." Trump leaned forward slightly, his usual bravado replaced by something softer. "You're wrong. You've got a lot to fight for. Not just for yourself, but for the people who need to see someone like you get back on their feet." A small silence hung in the room. Sarah's breath was shallow, but there was something about his words that made her feel seen, in a way that few had bothered to do. In that moment, she realized that someone cared. "Mr. President," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, "I don't know if I can keep going. It feels like everything I've done hasn't mattered." Trump's gaze softened, his voice steady but full of conviction. "It matters. You matter. And we're going to make sure you're not forgotten. Not now. Not ever." Sarah's lips trembled as she tried to hold back the tears. She had never been one for sentimentality, but in the quiet of the ICU, with Trump's words ringing in her ears, she realized something had shifted. She wasn't alone anymore. In the days that followed, the president's visit became a symbol of something larger. It wasn't just a visit. It was the beginning of a movement. Trump's commitment to changing the lives of those who had been left behind, forgotten by society, had sparked something powerful. A network of support, not just for the homeless, but for anyone who had felt like their battles were invisible, was starting to take shape. As Sarah recovered, she joined the efforts, speaking to others in similar circumstances. She became the voice of those who had been ignored for too long. Each day, she helped others find the courage to take the next step forward. And through it all, Trump stayed in touch. He made it clear that this wasn't a temporary effort. It was a long-term commitment to making sure no one who had served, no one who had struggled, would ever feel forgotten again. Months passed, and Sarah's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The doctors, once skeptical about her chances, marveled at her resilience. She had become a symbol of perseverance, not only to herself, but to everyone who heard her story. As she slowly regained her strength, she found herself more determined than ever to continue the work that had begun with that one simple conversation in the ICU. Sarah began traveling with the President's Initiative, sharing her experience with others in need. She spoke at homeless shelters, rehabilitation centers, and community outreach programs, telling her story of struggle, survival, and the power of human connection. Everywhere she went, people were moved by her words, and many found the courage to take the first steps toward rebuilding their own lives. One of Sarah's most impactful moments came when she stood before a group of veterans at a recovery center. These men and women, who had given their all for their country, now found themselves battling not just the scars of war, but the wounds of isolation and neglect. Sarah shared her own journey, emphasizing how it was the simple act of someone reaching out that had made all the difference for her. "It doesn't matter how far down we've fallen," Sarah said, her voice strong yet compassionate. "What matters is that we remember we're worth fighting for. We all have a story, and no one should feel invisible. We deserve to be seen, heard, and supported." Her words struck a chord with the veterans, many of whom had never been given the chance to share their own stories. After the speech, several approached Sarah, their eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. They spoke of their struggles with addiction, homelessness, and PTSD, but they also spoke of newfound resolve, thanks to Sarah's example. Back in Washington, Trump continued his work, not just as a leader, but as a beacon of change for those who had been forgotten. His team worked tirelessly to provide support for the homeless and veterans, but they also took a step further, creating educational programs, job opportunities, and mental health services for those who had nowhere to turn. Through it all, Sarah remained a central figure in this movement, a reminder to the world that everyone, no matter their past, deserved a second chance. One day, as Sarah sat in a small office in Washington, she received a letter from the White House. It was an invitation to a special ceremony, one that would honor the efforts of those who had made significant contributions to the initiative. Sarah, overwhelmed, could hardly believe what she was reading. She had never expected recognition. All she had ever wanted was to help others find the same hope she had found. The ceremony was held in the White House, and as Sarah entered the room, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This wasn't just a moment of personal triumph. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt overlooked, forgotten, or dismissed. As she stood before the president and a crowd of distinguished guests, Trump looked at her with pride. "Sarah, your story is one of incredible strength and resilience," Trump said, his voice warm. "You've turned your life around, and now you're helping others do the same. You are a true inspiration, and we are proud to have you as part of this movement." The applause that followed was overwhelming, but it was the look of acknowledgement in the eyes of the people around her that made Sarah's heart swell. She had been given a platform, yes, but more than that, she had been given a voice, and with it, she would continue to make a difference. As Sarah left the ceremony, she reflected on everything she had been through. She thought about the days when she had felt hopeless, when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. But now she stood tall. She had found her purpose, and that purpose was to ensure that no one else would ever have to feel as lost as she once had. In the years that followed, Sarah's life continued to evolve. She became a tireless advocate for the homeless, veterans, and those struggling with mental health issues. Her work inspired countless others to take action, to stand up, and to believe that change was possible, no matter how difficult the road ahead. And through it all, She never forgot the man who had believed in her when no one else did. The man who had seen her, truly seen her, in the darkest moment of her life. Donald Trump had been more than just a president to her. He had been a catalyst for her transformation, a reminder that sometimes all it takes is one person to change everything. As Sarah looked out over the crowd at one of her community outreach events, she smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. The journey was far from over, but she was no longer fighting alone. Together, they would continue to change lives, one day at a time. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her heart racing, but her voice steady as she spoke. "I stand here today because I refused to believe the world had written me off," she began, her words filled with strength. "People like President Trump didn't give up on me. And because of that, I found the strength to believe in myself again." Her words struck a chord in the room, and she continued, "There will always be people who tell you that you're not enough, that you've failed. But that's a lie. You matter. No matter where you come from, no matter how broken you feel, you matter to this world." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd, seeing the familiar faces of those who had been through their own battles. "I spent years feeling invisible, like I didn't matter, like no one cared. But I'm here to tell you that you do. You matter, and no matter how dark it gets, you don't have to face it alone." The room fell silent, her words hanging in the air. Sarah stepped down from the stage and approached a woman in the front row who seemed to be struggling. Kneeling beside her, Sarah took her hand gently. "You're not alone," she whispered. The woman's eyes filled with tears, and Sarah knew that feeling all too well, the pain, the fear, the loneliness. She had lived it. Returning to the stage, Sarah's voice was steady, more powerful now. "It only takes one person to believe in you. If that person doesn't come, be that person for someone else. That's how change begins." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in, before adding, "I used to think that no one cared, that I was too far gone. But then someone gave me hope, and everything changed." The room was filled with a quiet energy, the weight of her words sinking in. "You can't wait for others to believe in you," she said, her voice full of conviction. "Believe in yourself, and the rest will follow. This is where it starts. Right here, right now. I am living proof it's never too late to turn things around. And if I can do it, so can you." She took a deep breath, looking at the faces in front of her, and continued, "I know what it's like to feel like there's no way out. But there's always a way. You might not see it today, but it's there. Keep going. Keep fighting. The battle might be long, but there is always a chance for victory." The applause that followed wasn't just for her. It was for everyone in that room who had the courage to keep going, to keep fighting. Sarah stepped off the stage, her heart full, knowing this wasn't the end, but just the beginning. And as she looked around, she saw something that brought tears to her eyes. People were smiling, not just out of courtesy, but because they believed in what she was saying. They believed in the possibility of change. As she walked toward the exit, a young man caught her eye and nodded, a silent thank you in his gaze. Sarah knew that this was why she did it. To be the hope for someone else who needed it. To be the one to say, "You can do this. You're not alone." And as you read this, think of someone who needs to hear these words. Reach out to them. Send them a message. Offer a kind word. Because sometimes all it takes is one person to start a ripple of change. Let's continue changing lives together. One person, one day at a time. We all have a role to play in lifting others up. It's never too late to make a difference. And it all starts with us.